Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast where we share insight from the industry leaders on how to build great tech products and companies. This is Ankur and Nalima, your hosts. In today's show, we have Lee Klarich, Chief Product Officer at Palo Alto Networks, the leader in cybersecurity space. Lee has been with the company since the early days, and suffice it to say that without Lee's vision and leadership, Palo Alto Networks won't be the cybersecurity juggernaut that it is today. If you're interested in learning about how to build market leading products that go from zero to multi-billion dollar businesses, learn how to create new market categories, learn about creating a company culture that scales from less than 10 employees to thousands of employees, you don't want to miss this episode. Hello, Lee. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Ankur. Thanks for having me.
Let's just get right into it. So, I want to get started with a little bit about your journey leading up to Palo Alto Networks. Legend has it that upon graduation, you just moved to California without a job, kind of chasing the Silicon Valley dream. Tell us a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, it was college was an interesting experience. It was on the East Coast, cold weather, and at graduation had the opportunity to stay on the East Coast with a job in consulting. And somehow I had a feeling that wasn't really what I wanted to do. And I was fortunate enough that my girlfriend at the time, my wife, my now wife, she had a brother who was working out in Silicon Valley, and he said, "Oh, you guys should come out to Silicon Valley. It'd be easy to get a job." I thought, "All right, well, that sounds better than consulting." So we backed up her car and we drove to California. And then I'm old enough now that when we got here, we looked at the newspaper every day, circled jobs in the newspaper, and called, and just kept doing that and got my first job. So took a couple months, but it was I'd saved up enough money from working summers that was able to make that last until I started getting my first paycheck.
Pretty amazing. Luckily, I skipped the newspaper part myself. Back in my days, it was used to be this site called dice.com and all of that. I don't even know if those things are still around.
Okay.
But pretty interesting way. So initially, you kind of get into the tech bandwagon, if you will. You had a couple stints, one at obviously Juniper and others. When did you decide to go into an early stage company? Back then, you're just graduating. You've got the background. You could have worked in any company, made a lot of money, paid off all your debt, but you decided to make a big bet in a smaller company. Kind of tell us, how did you get to Palo Alto Networks and all the events leading up to that?
So yeah, I worked at a couple companies out of college, and during that time, I figured out that I really wanted to do product management. I think now maybe more people know that there's even a job called product management, but at the time it wasn't. I think something a lot of people heard about it in college, and so when I first met product managers and I started talking about what they did and what their job was, I said, "That's the job I want to do." But it took a couple companies and doing various work in various roles. And then I finally got my first opportunity to do product management at a company called NetScreen. NetScreen was a firewall company. They were founded in, I think, late 1997. I joined in the middle of 2000. They were already sort of, I say, successful, but still relatively small, maybe 120, 130 people. And I joined as really an entry-level product manager there, and worked my way up. NetScreen was acquired by Juniper about 4 years later. This was after they had gone public. Successful public offering, successful acquisition by Juniper, and a lot of great experience for me. Learned a lot of things I would say in some cases, learned a lot of things not to do that actually informed the early years at Palo Alto Networks when I eventually joined here. But that experience of being acquired was actually quite hard. And so I can say that a lot of what I learned on the being acquired side, I've tried to learn from. And obviously, with both of you here for a couple of years, I think very happy. Hopefully, it indicates we learned something good from it. But in any case, when about a year and a half, 2 years into Juniper, I just realized it wasn't really the right thing for me. And I had very good memories of early NetScreen days when it was small, and I'd worked with Nir before, and so I gave him a call. Nir was the founder, of course, of Palo Alto Networks, and said, "Hey, what are you doing? I think we should go. I think we should work together." And he had just raised money at Palo Alto Networks, and that's how that's 14 and a half years ago. That's how I started.
That is pretty exciting. Even today, the although the way people hunt the job hasn't changed, but the way you network still stays the same. You got to know the right people who will get you to the right place. And as they say, follow the smart people. And Near certainly is one of the smartest in the industry, especially in our space. Very good background.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was
Well,
a. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Nalima. I was just going to say a funny story, and I didn't piece it together until a few months after I joined Palo Alto Networks. So when I was still at Juniper, we had the opportunity to brief a pretty high-ranking person in the Pentagon, and a senator came out with them, and they had come out to Silicon Valley to meet with a number of companies to understand what were the big new sort of threats that, from a technology perspective, that they should be aware of, they should be paying attention to. And I remember we put together a briefing, and I was one of three people at Juniper that kind of described this piece. And the topic I picked was applications were bypassing traditional security infrastructure, because traditional security infrastructure was based on ports and protocols, and applications had all sort of moved to run at the application layer and all this kind of stuff. And I still remember the senator leaned over to the Pentagon person, and I heard him whisper, and he goes, "This is what we heard about yesterday, right?" And I thought to myself, like, who yesterday? Like, this is my idea. And and it was a few months into Palo Alto Networks, and I was talking to Nir one day, and I told him that story. He goes, "Oh yeah, I met with him the day before you did." So, um, it just interesting sort of story that at that time Nir was obviously thinking a lot about what the next thing in network security needed to be. I had started to think along those lines. And so when I talked to him and heard what Palo Alto Networks was working on, it just immediately resonated with me. And so, and I'd worked with Nir before. I knew what he was capable of. And so it's been a great time working together with him. And it's not common that you would see the number of people we had in the early days of Palo Alto Networks are still with the company, like Nir and myself, but many others as well that are still here, still passionately engaged in what we're doing.
Lee, how were the early days in Palo Alto Networks?
Surprisingly calm, and that may surprise a lot of people. I doubt that's normal, but Nir and Rajiv, who was one of the other co-founders and ran engineering for many years, and then when I joined, I would say, and even before I joined, they had hired about, I think it's probably about the first 15 or 20 engineers. And through various contacts, they had hired really the top 3 or 4 engineers from 5 or 6 different companies, which that is relatively unusual. Most startups will hire from a single company or a single set of people they know. And Rajiv and Nir had very specifically tried to branch out to there was a number of people from McAfee. There was obviously some folks from Juniper, NetScreen, Parabit, one or I can't remember right now. And so everyone really knew what they were doing. Now, we still had I'll call it the risk of, if we built the wrong thing or if customers didn't want it, obviously that risk was still very real and is probably one of the bigger risks that most startups face. But we had a lot of confidence that what we were building was needed by customers. We had a lot of confidence that we would actually be able to build it. And we had a lot of confidence that if we were successful at all of it, it could be a big deal. So we were certainly working hard, but also working in a way that you would work if you had strong belief that you're going to be working for many years together.
Sounds good. And when Palo Alto Networks started, firewall was an established market. And you have a very interesting story on how the next gen pieces of that evolved. And we created a new category around that. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's a term that maybe some of you have heard: red ocean, blue ocean. Red ocean markets, blue ocean markets. So red ocean markets, the red it's the chum, it's the blood in the water. These are markets with fierce competition, and then blue ocean is markets that don't really yet exist. And sometimes startups like to have ideas that are blue ocean, meaning they'll come out with something, no one else does it, there's no competition. It's kind of nice sometimes. Now, the challenge, of course, is if no one else does it, then companies probably don't have budget for it. And so your challenge there becomes, how do you actually create budget? Red ocean, budget exists. Companies are spending money, how much money they spend on it, because there's a lot of companies that already do it. In that case, you're coming out with something where you're going to try to do it better than everyone else. And we actually had to decide early on whether we wanted to take what we were building and try to make it a blue ocean product or a red ocean product. Blue ocean would have been that we were building an application controller. No one has an application controller. We would have been the first. So we could have built this, we could have released it as this application controller. No one has it. Let us sell you a new product in a new category and try to develop that new category. The other option was red ocean. Firewalls exist, IPSs exist, proxies exist. These are all big multi-billion-dollar markets, even back then. And after I probably had about 100 customer meetings in the first year I was at Palo Alto Networks before we had even sold to a single customer. These were meetings just to talk about what we were doing. And very early on in these conversations, it became clear to me that we needed to go down the red ocean path, that we were going to go into the firewall market and basically say, everything legacy is dead. You need something new. That new approach is next-gen firewall, and here's how it's defined. This was a pretty big debate, as you can imagine. These are two pretty different strategies. The thing that tipped me to this direction, though, was an experience from a few years before that. A company that many probably do not remember anymore, a company called Tipping Point, was an IPS, intrusion prevention system. They came out, I want to say like 2001 timeframe, plus or minus. They came out as an IPS. They marketed themselves an IPS. They called themselves an IPS. The data sheet said they're an IPS. The website said they're an IPS. And about 3 or 4 years in, they suddenly came out and said, actually, our IPS is a firewall also. We're a firewall and an IPS. Everyone laughed at them. You can't just wake up one day and be a firewall. You're an IPS. Go back to being an IPS. You're confused. You're not a firewall. And they tried this for about a year before they went back to being just an IPS. And they did that for another few years. And then after a few more years, guess what? They launched again. That they're a firewall. Firewall plus IPS. No, really this time. We're a firewall plus IPS. Everyone laughed at them again and said, no, you can't just wake up one day and be a firewall. It doesn't work that way. Yep, you should go back to being an IPS. So I learned from this that customers will not trust you if you wake up one day and suddenly say, hey, I'm a firewall. Because firewall is part of the infrastructure. It's hard. You have to be up 100% of the time and have high availability, be resilient. There's all sorts of requirements being a firewall. You can't just wake up one day and say you are. So I decided, well, not Near and head of marketing and others, we all decided, but I was pretty adamant, we're a firewall. And it was hard. We used to joke. We used to joke because the salespeople that we hired at first, they were a little bit nervous about being the firewall because customers were like, oh, don't tell me about being a firewall. Like I already have a firewall. Everyone had a firewall. It was truly all red ocean. There was no greenfield opportunities. And we used to joke. We used to say, you have to use the F word. Firewall, of course, because some of the sales teams were afraid to talk about being a firewall because The customers would be like, I already have a firewall. I'm not interested in talking to you. And it took a lot of energy to overcome that. But as we started to build credibility, guess what? We were a firewall, right?
Very interesting.
The firewall is the biggest network security market out there. And so, yes, it was maybe a little bit harder initially, but we established that credibility over the first, call it, few years of the company. And then we kept building on it and building on it.
I have to imagine that this is probably the toughest decision you and the leadership team ever had to make, because typically the playbook is that if you're going to go into a well-entrenched market, you don't try to go against the big boys. You say, no, I do something else, something completely different. So the eval criteria is completely different. You chose, as you call it, the red ocean strategy. And I'd imagine that back then, it was not like the investment and the liquidity was everywhere. Like, hey, VCs were like, hey, here's 100 million. Go do your experiment for 3 years. And if you fail, we'll give you some more. So this was a bet you're going to make. It had to succeed. If not, then you would be in a tipping point like position where you have to say, well, we're not a firewall, we're somebody else. How hard was this? I mean, was there a stage where you yourself doubted the big bet that you made for the company, or never in doubt?
I never doubted. And I don't mean that in like any sort of like I don't know, egotistical any way other than I just didn't doubt it. I talked to, like I said, I talked to 100 customers. I pitched them. I wasn't just like chatting with them. Like I was pitching them. I gave the pitch 100 times to 100 different customers to see how they would react, to see what questions they would ask, to see who it would resonate with, who it would not resonate with. It doesn't mean that it resonated. Like a lot of them said, no, I don't need that. I don't want that. I've got this, I've got that. But you listen closely to the feedback. And I knew when they said, oh, I already have that. And I said, well, what do you think provides that? They said, well, my proxy does. I go, I know technically that is not true whatsoever. Or some of them say, well, my packeteer traffic shaper does it. I knew for sure technically that was not a true statement. Like I was waiting for someone to say something where it's like, uh-oh, that's true. But it wasn't. They were just, I'll call it, somewhat misinformed from the marketing of these different vendors. So I knew that we had it. And I think Nir was fully confident. I think, I don't know, we just knew enough about the market. We knew enough about the technology. And we were fortunate. Sequoia and Greylock, who are the two principal VCs in the company, they're very willing to see companies swing for the fence, right? They're actually not really that interested in companies that are just going to kind of meander around a little bit and not do anything special. So they were very supportive of it. The one thing though that was very different then than I think it is a bit now. It wasn't necessarily easy to just get lots and lots of cash. I see companies now that raise $200 million in a Series C, and I'm like, 200, like, why on earth would you need that much money? We were a hardware company. Hardware costs like cash. You have to pay for hardware. We were a hardware company initially, and we, I think, got to cash flow break even at around $47 million.
Pretty
So,
impressive.
Wow.
yeah.
So you start a new category, get the validation from the first 50, 100 customers, whatever that may be, and you find the product market fit, right? And now it's the scale game. How do you go from, or how did you rather go from, okay, I think I've got like 100 customers or 200 customers where I've displaced the competition. We've got our own Palo Alto's next-gen firewall. Is it just then the scale game where you're just doing more of what has worked, hire more engineers, hire more sellers, hire more marketing? How do you then go from also one single product to multi-product? The core insight that we're looking for is you've got the critical traction. You're not going to go away. As a company, you have a future. But now the investors and public, everybody wants you to do 10x the sales. How do you do that?
Well, this is somewhat linked to the previous discussion, right? That by picking the markets we're going after as we did, by positioning ourselves into those markets, you have to remember we were therefore positioned into a $10 to $12 billion a year market between firewall, IPS, proxy. Those were probably the three main things that we would replace when we went into to a customer, if not multiples of those. So those early decisions really mattered a lot when it came time to scale, because it meant that we didn't need to pivot into other markets in order to scale into $100 million, into $500 million, into $1 billion, right? So what we needed to do was not quite as simple as just do everything we're doing, but more. But to some extent, that was kind of it. One of the things on the product side that I was always really focused on was making sure we didn't veer off course from the vision and strategy that we were on. Like, it's easy as a startup to chase deals and add features in order to win a deal. And I was always very regimented on, we're not adding features if they're not on the path toward where we eventually want to be. And where we eventually wanted to be, we knew, was large scale, serving large enterprise, hundreds of firewalls, next gen firewalls being deployed. So I was very adamant with my team that we not get off track of that goal. Certainly on the sales and marketing side is a lot of, how do you grow? How do you grow within the US? How do you grow into new markets, EMEA, Japan, Asia, etc.? Those each came with a set of challenges, obviously. But a lot of that even was just that same focus, making sure we don't, again, go too far off course in any different direction where you start to lower productivity. And as you lower productivity, then it's hard to invest, right? So let's stay focused. Let's stay focused. Who's the target customer? Who's the target channels to get there? What's the right profile? And then one last thing I'll share, and it probably was right around that, we'll call it 100 to 150 to 200 kind of customer range, is even at that scale of customers, I think Nir and I interviewed every salesperson and every SE. And once we hired them, we had a rule. He or I had to go out and go on customer calls with them within the first month. It was a rule. And many of them pushed back. They're like, no, I'm not ready for you to come out. It doesn't matter. We're coming out. We're going to sit on your couch if we have to. And that was really easy when we were hiring people in the US. When we started hiring people internationally, it became a little bit harder. But we continued it for a little while because it was just so important that they would learn the story, they learn the pitch, they learn the positioning, they learn the nuances of it. And that they would hear directly from us, like the things that we thought were really important, the things that we had seen successful elsewhere, making sure that knowledge was transferred quickly. And that was what a lot of it was in that sort of early sort of inflection period.
I can totally relate to that, Lee, because we see those founding principles being a guidance factor now when we are leading or adding new products. We hear it now again and again. So you're, at least in my limited experience, you're one of those rare CPOs who created the first market leading product for a company and then grew the company into a market leading portfolio of products, right? We have these three pillars. Through this journey, can you give us some insight into how do you retain, good or great diverse people, and then you end up building a product culture where you're going through multiple startup acquisitions? I personally believe we have done a great job at it, but looking for your insights here.
I'd say there's two things that, obviously there's a lot that goes into it. And there's a lot of people that are behind this. And some of the things I'll say are things I've learned from others on the team. So, and I'm sharing with you, but I'd say there's two things that we really focused on that I think have contributed the most. The first was on the hiring side. So we were always really focused on trying to hire people that were obviously really smart and good at what they do, and all of that kind of stuff. Like that's sort of the normal stuff that everyone does. But we also actually tried really hard to hire people that prioritized the having impact, working on things that were interesting and difficult challenges over people who were predominantly focused on wanting to make a lot of money or wanting to see their career take off. And not that people didn't make a lot of money and not that their careers didn't actually do wonderful, but it's a question of cause and effect, right? And so hiring people that had that impact motivation, work on and solve hard problems motivation, well, you get enough of those people together, guess what? You'll do good things and hopefully you'll make money and hopefully your careers do well. But those become the result of what you're working on. And I truly believe that was incredibly important in being able to attract good people and importantly, retain those good people, because good people like to work with those types of people. They're motivated by the right things. They don't get too distracted. The stock price goes up or down because they understand that's a separate thing. And they're a lot more focused on like customers. Are customers successful? How are the customers doing? And all of that. The second trait that I think I'll actually give Rajiv Batra, who was the head of engineering for the first many years on this, I'll give him credit, although I think, all of us were in tune with this decision. But if someone does not exhibit the behavior that is conducive to a high quality collaborative culture, who is highly disruptive, no matter how smart they are, they don't have a place. And there was a few people relatively early on that fit that description. They were really smart. They were really good. They would build things over the weekend. We're like, oh, this person's so great. But then after a while, you started to hear these rumblings from other people on the team, other people that we thought were also really good, who were like, yeah, I don't want to work with that person. And then second person, yeah, I don't want to work with that person either. And we took care of it. And I think that is critically important to, again, keeping the good people really happy and engaged and motivated. Again, enabling us to bring other good people in because they see that kind of environment and culture that they want to work in. So, and you have to take care of those things. I don't want to say quickly, but you have to, with the right level of urgency. You obviously want to make the right decisions. That's very important. But you can't let jerks stick around for a long time.
Yeah. Reed Hastings, kind of this famous manifesto of 120 slides on like Netflix culture. He talks about brilliant jerks get a hefty severance package. And I think it seems very obvious that thing to do. But when you have a top sales guy who's consistently producing, you have a top engineer who is, if he left, nobody else knows the code. It's a really hard decision when you are executing. So obviously, kudos to you and the team for staying true to that type of culture. Speaking of culture, right? Like recently, obviously, Ben Horowitz at A16Z wrote a book on culture, and Reed Hastings just came out with his book. What is culture to you? Is it just these silent norms? Hey, we don't allow brilliant jerks. Is it coffee breaks and lavish lunches? Like, what is culture to you, and how do you sustain it from like 100 people to like 8,000 people? How do you do that?
It's funny, over the course of the company, there's been multiple occasions where we've done the culture work where you send out the surveys and everyone responds and says, well, this is what I think our culture is. And then you take all the words and you put them together and you kind of come back and say, here's the 5 things we heard. And I remember we did it pretty early on, and then we did it again a few years later, did it again a few years after that. And we did it as recently as a couple of years ago. And which is a useful exercise, but it's not an exercise that how do I say it? Like you can't tell people like this is the culture and therefore you have to act this way because we said so. It doesn't. I mean, you can try it. Go ahead, right? I just don't. This is not how I think culture works. I think culture is something that is really much more bottoms up. It's really the combination of how everyone in the company acts and behaves, whether they're being watched or not, right? So if I'm doing work on my own or with one other person and no one else is watching, culture is a big part of how that interaction plays out, not just if I'm talking in all hands or in a large group setting or something like that. And the same is true with everyone in the company. And so, from my perspective, what that results in is it's just a lot of sort of by example. It's how Near behaves when working with engineers or talking to customers. It's how you guys behave. Like a lot of people look up to you and take cues from you. And how do you handle disappointment? How do you handle failure? How do you handle success? Right? How do you work with people that are not in your team that you need to influence? And even brand new employees, maybe new college grads that are coming in. People look to see how they behave. And so that to me is sort of what makes up the culture of a company, which is why it makes it so important back to hiring. Like, you have to hire really great people because they're going to become part of your culture. You have to get rid of the jerks because unfortunately they're part of your culture. And so and then it's a ever focused kind of challenge. You can't let it go. You can't say, well, yeah, when we were 500 people, this great culture. And so we just kind of sat back, put the hands behind the head and watched it thrive. Now you have to constantly cultivate it as well. So that's my view. And I think everyone, of course, is going to want to say we have great culture. You can't find a single company out there where I think leadership wouldn't say that. And so that's why, because it's like, I tell people, come experience it.
Yeah, it's not what you say, it's what you do. I'm sure Enron had a whole bunch of notice board that says, hey, we are a mission-driven company and we do this, that, and the other. And
integrity was
after that,
cultural values.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So, talking of product culture, one question I know product management is really close to your heart, Lee, right? What is a good way to measure PM success? Is revenue the bar? Is building solid products that customers love the bar? Is how you work with your engineering the bar? What is a good PM?
Well, those are all good things. First of all, product management's a very difficult job, right? Because really good product managers are technical enough to work closely with engineering, communicative enough to be able to evangelize their products and talking to customers, able to help train sales and SEs, work with marketing on positioning and messaging, working with operations, working with legal, working with IT, working with really every finance, every department of the company. And so it can be a very difficult job from that perspective. On the other hand, of course, it can be, certainly my view is it can be one of the most rewarding jobs as well. And so success is sort of a lot of different things. I certainly believe that the business of your product is a good measure. Is your product selling a lot or is it not selling at all? That's a very easy sort of kind of binary way of measuring it. Certainly not the only way to measure it, but it's one way. It's one indicator, if you will. Second, I would say is how receptive and happy are the customers of that product. That becomes a very significant feedback mechanism to a product manager's success if the product is doing really well. The sort of the motivation and clarity of what engineering is working on becomes a very important metric for determining how successful a product manager is. What I mean by that is if an engineering team is confused about what they're working on, or they're not really sure, or they constantly change direction in terms of what they work on, then that's a sign of probably of a product manager who's not doing their job well enough. But an engineering team that understands exactly what they're supposed to be delivering, they're working hard to deliver it without a lot of course corrections along the way, that's a sign, obviously, of a good engineering team, but often it means that they're paired up with a good product manager as well. So one of the things that we instituted early on when it came to product management was this notion of problem statements. And I know both of you have heard this before. And actually, I'm starting to see it a lot more at other companies, which is interesting. But when we instituted it, I hadn't seen it at any other company. We made it a requirement very early on in the company that you had to write a problem statement that your product was going to solve, or your feature was going to solve. And this was to ensure that the product manager knew the value of what they're building, right? Without that, there's a lot of feature requests and a lot of like, oh, we're going to go do blank. But the problem statement was why are you going to go do blank? What are you going to try to solve with that? How important is that problem to solve? And that became one of the core tenets of the product management organization from a relatively early on stage. And it, to this day, it still exists within the teams. We still, on a monthly basis, hold problem statement training for new product managers coming into the organization. And it is a lot harder than most people think. That'll be my challenge to anyone listening to this, is to actually go try to think through and describe a problem with as much clarity as you possibly can. And I guarantee you it will be harder than you thought going into it.
Cool. Okay, so with that, we come to the rapid fire section. So I'll ask a series of questions, and you can answer yes or no, or you can give names. First question.
Actually,
Yeah.
Nilima, sorry to interrupt. We'll redact this particular portion. Actually, before we go to rapid fire, I was curious about a couple more things, if that's okay. So I guess the good segue into something else I wanted to also ask you, sort of above and beyond Palo Alto Networks, like how has, if you think about security industry and the landscape, how has it changed over the last couple of decades, and what do you think the next 10-year holds for the industry? Folks who want to get into security, is it kind of following the cyclic pattern, or is it an up and up because the next gen attacks you see, existential threat to state and nations, are now all security related? Like, what's remained the same? What's changed over the last few decades?
Well, I think I'll give you two quick answers maybe. So one is what you're describing. The importance of cybersecurity certainly has gone up. So 2 decades ago, obviously it was important, but then it was, the adversary was mostly, often it was like teenagers or whatnot, just trying to get some notoriety. And so it was DOS attacks, it was network worms, it was things like that. It was sort of more almost innocent by today's standards. Now, aside from the fact that it's an industry like where people make billions and billions of dollars on it, obviously the nation state aspect is interesting and important. You have companies whose entire business is now online. So the stakes have certainly never been higher. And I think that will only continue in the direction it's been going. The other aspect that I'd say has not changed. And in my view, it needs to change. In my view, it was something early on at Palo Alto Networks that we were focused on. And that is the cybersecurity industry is incredibly fragmented. And the problem with that is there's so many different companies that produce so many different products that customers have to try to stitch together, that operationally security is completely overwhelming. And so stakes never been higher, but if you are trying to do security, it's never been more overwhelming than it is today. And so I actually firmly believe that the industry needs to, we'll call it simplify, as I say, consolidate as well, but simplify. There needs to be fewer products that a customer has to deploy in order to achieve very high degrees of security, because otherwise that complexity only gets worse and will only put them further behind in being able to deal with today's adversary.
Absolutely. Yeah, with 2,000 plus vendors and like, I don't know, 10,000 products. I mean, I feel really bad for the CISOs. I don't even know how they make a decision. Obviously, the easy decision is to buy Palo Alto Networks, but beyond that, how do they even decide what to buy? Because you are right, there's just too much complexity, too much of scare techniques, and the industry can go through a little bit of a simplification, like you said.
Look, I don't even mean it as a Palo Alto Networks advertisement. It really is just an industry statement. Like I've talked to companies that have over 300 security vendors. That's just not feasible to operate. And there's only more capabilities that are going to be required in the future, not less. And so we have to see that complexity start to move in the other direction. In some cases, we have in targeted areas. I honestly believe and have seen that. We just need to make more progress more quickly.
Got it. Last question before we move into the rapid fire. So, you're a busy executive on a regular basis, you're having to make a lot of decisions. And although now we have lots and lots of information, it's almost like we have too much information. Do you have a decision making framework? First principles, you're known to be an extremely detailed oriented leader. How do you make complex decision on a day in day out basis? What do you delegate? What is the thing that you must approve? How do you think about it?
I wish I could tell you, oh, I've got this framework and it takes these 3 steps, and as long as you follow these three steps, everything is fine. I don't, and maybe at some point, if I slow down enough, I can actually try to think through how to codify the thought process. What I'll tell you, I can't say for sure, but I think there's a couple of things that tend to be sort of, I'll call it skills or traits that I use to my advantage in this regard. One is I constantly am trying to create clarity out of all of that information, trying to organize and group it into just a few key things, throw away, if you will, stuff that seems interesting, but maybe not quite so relevant, until I get down to like 3 or 4 critical aspects that I believe make up the framework for how to make a decision on whatever it happens to be. The second thing is, and this has to do with, I have a large team and a lot of really fantastic people on the team, like the two of you and others as well. And not to give away my secrets, but I'm pretty good at coming up with just 2 or 3 questions, and just based on the interaction. And depending on the answers to those questions, if the answers are solid, rock solid, then I will assume that the rest of it is solid as well. But if I get questionable responses to those questions, and questionable either because it's clear that the person's uncertain, but more often that's actually not the case. More often, the answer won't be quite right. I have a pretty good sense for when the person is confidently saying something that they don't know. And when I hear that, then I dig, because now I know that they haven't thought through at least one thing. And if they haven't thought through one thing, then they probably haven't thought through other things as well. Question them for a while and I'll kick it back. And so the two of you may have been on the receiving end of that particular technique that I used before. sorry about that.
It just makes you think. I actually appreciate that technique a lot.
Yeah, good news is that we just now know that need to be prepared with answers, solid answers to first couple questions, and then everything else is a breeze. Excellent.
All right.
Right.
So rapid fire now. Okay. So Lee, we're going to ask some questions, and you can say yes or no or short answers, or if you can elaborate on some of those, that will be great too. All right. So first question: if you could shadow someone, who would that be?
Elon Musk.
Can I ask why?
I thought it was rapid fire. Incredibly smart, highly controversial, and seems genuinely motivated to change the world.
Your favorite B2B product in the market outside of Palo Alto products?
B2B?
Enterprise product, yeah.
I don't know. I spent all my time thinking about our products. Favorite B2B product?
You can do B2C.
Yeah, B2C.
Oh, B2C? What's my favorite product lately? I'm gonna go with my Garmin watch. It is absolutely amazing. I'm a runner, and the amount of data that can now accurately be uh, generated and stored on such a lightweight, battery lasting a week or longer device is amazing.
One advice you'd give to your younger self?
Probably some combination of patience and listen more. I think sometimes maybe a little bit, from a work perspective, maybe a bit brash at work. I was always so motivated, focused, and I'd probably say just a little bit more patience, a little bit more listening, and yeah.
Great answer. What have you read recently, or what are you reading right now? Any of the two?
Let's see. Well, I just finished reading was actually a running book, so on training. So Dina Castor's "Let the Mind Run." So she's, for those who don't know, she's one of the greatest American distance runners of all time, and she wrote a book talking about how to use your mind to sort of overcome the body's desire to feel fatigued, so to speak. So interesting book, obviously applicable to lots of different sports, but I think to some extent even applicable outside of sports into other things that we all do.
And last question: ad hoc time versus planned time?
Sorry, say it again.
Ad hoc time versus planned time?
Oh, I think we all need more ad hoc time. And I think we all have too much planned time. And that's something we should probably go work on. How do we free up our calendars a little bit to have a little more creativity?
Absolutely. It reminds me of a episode I was watching when Charlie Rose had Bill Gates and Warren Buffett on the show, and Bill Gates is like, when I was a CEO, I had all kinds. Everything was on calendar, and he goes, but Warren runs a really high tech calendaring system. He had a diary with his calendar, and the entire diary was empty. There was nothing scheduled. And Charlie goes, what's going on, Warren, here? And he goes, I can buy everything. I just can't buy time. So I need a lot of me time, a lot of thinking time that clears things up, because there are all these people wanting your time, etc. Everything is planned, then you don't have anything to think creatively. So I 100% agree. Need a lot of ad hoc time.
Yeah.
Both Nilima and I really appreciate your time. We really enjoyed it. I think this was incredibly insightful podcast for us and our listeners. So thank you again.
Of course. Very happy to join you both. As when you reached out to me, like I said, you're both just absolutely fantastic. Love having you on the team, working with you. And so more than happy to join, and hopefully